Hi, I'm Ray Dempsey, and this is Chapter and Verse. Thank you for joining us today. With us today, in part two of our presentations, is my friend and classmate Raymond L. Sickinger, professor of history at Providence College, and somewhat of an expert on Nazi Germany and the lessons that it gives to others who want to examine a portrait of evil. I mean, how does a modern, Western, industrialized civilization, known for its culture and in its medical work, I mean, the medical journals of Germany were considered the envy of the world. Mm-hmm. And yet, medicine was corrupted, culture was corrupted, 12 million people were put to their deaths in an untimely way. And we're wondering, are there lessons for us in 2019 which we're about to lose if we don't remember what happened in a modern Western industrialized nation of Germany?
You know, the last time we were talking, right at the very end, Ray, we were talking about, you raised the question of social Darwinism.
Yes.
And whether, Hitler was impacted. And I had mentioned that absolutely. And that whole social Darwinist framework started with Herbert Spencer, who applied Darwin's ideas to society. And then others took his idea and applied them, to the idea of racism and so forth, racial differences. And the distinction of different races, basically inferior races, superior, these all come out of a social Darwinist idea. And the idea of social Darwinism is that life is a struggle, and only the fittest survive in that struggle. And that is definitely something that Hitler picked up on. In fact, he felt so strongly that it was a struggle or a survival for the fittest that he felt that there was only a particular ideology that could overcome that. And that ideology began with race, the idea that there is a superior race, the Aryan race, and that race is not just blonde hair, blue eyes, strong physically, which many people automatically associate with the Aryan race, but it also, they are mentally and morally superior as well. And then that race must be preserved, and that's the fundamental purpose of the Reich, the state. And then the state, in order to preserve the race, must expand and find room for it. What the Germans would call, or the Nazis would call, Lebensraum. They must expand, and that expansion is towards the east, into areas like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and definitely Russia, particularly the Ukraine. And as they expand east, they can enslave those inferior peoples. And that's how we'll win the struggle for survival. So it's a very, very social Darwinist concept that really infuses much of Hitler's thought. What's also interesting is that we will oftentimes hear of the Third Reich. And the Third Reich actually has as we talked about in my article last week, a magical connotation to it, because what it involves is millenarian thinking. The Nazis always talked of the Reich of 1,000 years.
Yes.
And there's a magical or mystical both side to that number 1,000. That's why there's been so many millenarian movements. And most millenarian movements think that this is a crucial time, a leader is going to come forth, there are enemies opposed to us, and we must act fast to deal with those enemies. And that's exactly the kind of millenarian thinking that was in Nazi Germany. Hitler portrayed himself as the savior, a savior actually sent in many ways by the divine to save the German people from their enemies, and time was wasting and he had to take tough decisions. And so you end up having a very destructive regime come in, because people after World War I were fearful of the times, very unsettled, and here was someone promising them some kind of security. But security comes at a price sometimes.
Oh, yes.
It's at a big price.
Yes, I heard of a speech that he gave. Apparently, he observed a woman in the market having difficulty paying for her groceries. And apparently she was going to take off her wedding ring and barter with a wedding ring to buy food, according to the account. And Hitler raised the roof about this, and he said, never should this happen in Germany, and never will it happen anymore if he has his way. So he laid out a carpet of security for people.
Yes. Well, you know, one of the things that I've learned from friends of mine in the political science field is that oftentimes people vote the way they feel about the economy, interestingly enough. All other issues aside, if they feel pretty good about how they're doing and what's in their pocketbook at the moment of voting, they'll vote that way. And I think that's what happened in Nazi Germany as well. The Nazis promised, and they definitely produced an economy that was going strong. In fact, you had almost zero unemployment. And so people felt very good. So good, in fact, that they overlooked, didn't think about some of the other things that were going on. People thought, for example, especially in the period of 33, the first year that Hitler was in power, they thought, well, yeah, I know he talks about the Jews and so forth, but he can't be really serious. Well, he was very deadly serious about the Jews. And from the moment he came into power, there were systematic steps towards the Jews and others that he considered inferior. So again, people can be sucked into a system because they feel a sense of security, because it doesn't impact them directly at the moment, and because, as we said, I think last week, they don't take time to really reflect on the implications of what's happening. It
was terrible, the way people followed the leader in Germany. There was a photograph of an entire wall of men, maybe soldiers, and they were giving the Nazi salute. And there was one person who didn't give the Nazi salute, and the hunt was on to find that one individual and get the story about what happened there. Mm-hmm. The whole rest of the wall of people were giving there was one person who didn't give the salute, and the hunt was on.
Oh. Well, you know, what you're talking about there, too, I think is very relevant to what we're speaking about. One of the things that Hitler and the Nazis did was they feared, but they admired the Catholic Church. And one of the things they admired about the Catholic Church was its rituals, because rituals are very important to a religious faith or a religious group. The rituals are what binds people together. And so they would take those rituals, but use them for their own purposes. So, for example, when they were at Nuremberg in 1934, Albert Speer did these huge lights on the side so that though they were outside on the Zeppelin field, when they came on the field and those lights went on at night, everyone said, I thought I was inside a cathedral. Well, it wasn't a religious ceremony, but you see, it evoked the same kind of spiritual experience for them. And then, every time Hitler spoke, he's up on a huge platform, so he's way above the crowd. Being above the crowd, he always seems like the person in the know, the savior, the person who's been sent. And so your fealty, your loyalty is to them. And we all know that when you're in large crowds, you tend to act differently than when you're in either a small group or by yourself.
Social psychology.
Exactly. And so if others are saluting and if others are going wild, you do. In fact, it's so very interesting. I think his name is George Moss, if I remember. I know the last name is Moss, a Jewish historian. He writes on the Nazi era. And he says, you know, as a young man, I went to a Hitler rally. And he said, halfway through that Hitler rally, without my knowing, I saw myself giving the salute and saying, Heil Hitler.
Wow.
And here was a young Jewish man.
Yeah.
That was the kind of power that Hitler's speech had and the rituals that he brought people together with. And so they recognized that power. They were really trying to build their own new religion. It wasn't a Christian religion, but it was a religion that they would be able to control. In fact, interestingly, in Nazi ideas about religion, they had the idea that Christ was not a Jew. Christ was an Aryan, and he had been driven out at one point and went to the Middle East, and so he was a Jew. And in fact, he had criticized the Pharisees and so forth because he recognized what a threat the Jews were. And so Christ was actually following an anti-Semitic policy. And therefore, if we are following Christ, we need to be anti-Semitic.
They were involved in the mythology of the Norse and the German mythology.
Absolutely, yeah, the Teutonic mythology.
Even the Lebensborn program, which you mentioned last week, was adorned with religious and Norse religion.
Religious elements, sure. In fact, what happened is with SS men, most of the SS ended up buying into, or at least going along with, this kind of Nazi religious approach. They wouldn't baptize their children. There was an ancient Teutonic name-giving ceremony. And it had all the same kinds of trappings as a baptism without any of the Christian elements.
I'm happy that we're talking about this this week and last week, because I think we're on the verge of losing knowledge of an object lesson which is very helpful to us in our contemplation and in our planning for a better life and a better society. We'd like to find out what people did wrong and not repeat it. And I hope we don't repeat it.
No. You know, one of the things too, the church went through a very difficult time, but there was one decision looking back that I think the church itself would say it wished it had done differently. It was done for all the right intentions to try to protect the church, but that was the Concordat of 1933 with Adolf Hitler. It was intended to protect the church, but one of the concessions the church had to give at that time was that its members could not be actively speak out on politics or get engaged.
Something?
And there was, well-intentioned, but there was a major error because it removed for several years, crucial years, that voice. And it doesn't mean that there weren't individuals who spoke up. There were. But it gave the church's voice, it diminished it a bit in terms of a social justice position. And I think the church looks back on that and says, we regret that. And in fact, Pius XI tried very strongly to reverse that when they came out with the encyclical in 1937, Mit Planenda Certa, with burning concern, deep anxiety, that really pointed to all the elements in Nazi ideas and ideals, the racial ideals and so forth, that were really pagan and were really anti-Christian.
Pius XII, apparently, from an early time in the church, before he became Pope, had a grassroots intelligence service.
Yes.
Because his priests would tell him things and the laity would tell him things. And it was said that he knew more about the German people than Hitler did, because Hitler didn't have as extensive a gathering of information from the grassroots of Germany. But there were people, and people seem to have lost their freedom of conscience, which you mentioned before. There were some people who there were trains filled with Holocaust detainees. They were on the trains and ready to go to the gas chambers.
Yes.
And they were calling out for help. They'd call out from the trains. And there was a group of Protestants, I think, who used to have a band, a musical band, to drown out the sounds of people who were calling out for help.
Yes, yes. You know, the sad thing is, even nurses in the Red Cross, German nurses in the Red Cross, would not respond to those trains. And what's also interesting is the insights some of the people, they interviewed, for example, some of the train drivers, the people who drove the engineers. And one engineer said, well, he said, yeah, I suspected, I knew what was going on. But he said, if I didn't do it, I'd lose my job. And what would happen to my family? And if I didn't do it, someone else would do it.
Yeah.
And so instead of taking a stand and recognizing that, well, whether I lose my job or not, at least I can live with myself in conscience, I think it's that kind of utilitarian thinking, that practical thinking, well, if I don't do it, someone else does it, that human nature falls into all too quickly. And that leads to people doing the kinds of things that they did.
There were some priests and some ministers who objected to the Nazi experiment. And they were put in prison along with the other inmates of the concentration camps.
Yeah.
Maximilian Kolbe.
Yeah, Maximilian Kolbe is a wonderful example. Yeah. Maximilian Kolbe not only stepped up to take the place of a prisoner that was going to be killed. What a lot of people don't realize, and what I think is the most heroic and the most significant act he did, in the chamber with the other people that were starving, there were several soldiers who later converted to Catholicism who said, we have done this before. This was not the first time prisoners were starved to death. Mm-hmm. They said, we've done this before, and usually by the fourth or fifth day, the howling, the cursing, the swearing that comes from below is incredible. And they said, nothing came from below except hymn singing and prayers. And so throughout the entire ordeal, Maximilian Kolbe was able to lead those people, starving to death, himself included, in a peaceful death. That is absolutely mind-boggling as far as I'm concerned.
He didn't starve fast enough. They wound up giving him an injection of poison.
He was one of the last to go, yeah, because he did not want to die before all the others died. Before all the others died. And there were a number of people who stood up for their faith, both Protestants and Catholics. For example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, is a wonderful example. Also, besides that, Cardinal Faulhaber in Germany was an outspoken critic. Bishop Galen, von Galen, I believe his name was an outspoken critic of the T4 program, for example. So, I mean, there were voices, but oftentimes those voices, unfortunately, were drowned out by larger masses and larger forces.
I want to bring people's attention to the article that you wrote on the Third Reich, Hitler and the Occult, the magical thinking of Adolf Hitler. Explain magic like we did last week.
Yes. Well, magic, most people, when they think of magic, they think of David Copperfield, an illusionist.
Yes.
That's a modern form of magic in terms of a definition of magic. But what magic means in a cultural or anthropological sense is that there is a time in history where people thought that they could really manipulate or control nature, other people, and the divine. And they could do that by either willing something or by following very precise patterns of behavior, either way. And that's called magic. That's what really magic is. And so with Adolf Hitler really believed that if he willed something, it could happen. He also believed that if he had this particular vision and he didn't deviate from it, that he would achieve his results. And so both of those things exhibit magical thinking.
He seemed very taken with the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche,
Yes.
In fact, he gave copies of Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Absolutely.
Was it Stalin, Hirohito, and Mussolini?
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting about Nietzsche, because Nietzsche himself said that racism is a scabby on the human heart.
Interesting.
So that Nietzsche himself would have been absolutely opposed to racism, though he had other ideas that we all know. For example, the idea that God is dead. Now, again, Nietzsche didn't say, I'm saying God is dead. He's saying, I'm looking around, and it doesn't look like people believe in God anymore. That's really what Nietzsche was saying. And therefore, we've got to look other ways. Nietzsche had a concept of what's called the Übermensch, the overman.
Superman.
Which, it's usually interpreted Superman. And what it means is that the person can rise above the average person. Well, the Nazis, including Hitler, took these ideas and misused them. Interestingly, when Nietzsche died, he died of mental illness in 1900. His sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, was a rabid anti-Semite, so was her husband. She got control of his works, and she would only publish those things that supported Nazi ideas and ideals.
Oh.
And in fact, the Nazis took his term Übermensch and applied it to themselves. We are the Supermen. But they also coined another term, Untermensch, which means subhuman, below human, lower than human. Nietzsche never used that term. So it's really interesting that Nietzsche's ideas, even though I have some real problems with them, many of those ideas were misused by the Nazis. Even he himself would hate to see how those ideas were used. And in fact, it really wasn't until after World War II, in the 1950s, if I remember correctly, that Walter Kaufmann and others began to get a hold of all Nietzsche's texts, and we got a much better idea of what Nietzsche was actually saying and where his ideas were misused by the Nazis. But the Nazis tagged Friedrich Nietzsche as one of their own and used some of his thoughts, or better, misused some of his thoughts.
You mentioned a few things. Hitler, some writer thought that Hitler had a problem with the occult, and that he got involved in certain monstrous sexual perversion in order to obtain clairvoyant powers and mediumistic powers.
Right.
Has that been substantiated, or is that a controversial thought?
Yeah, that's a very controversial thought. What has happened, Ray, is there have over the years been what I call two different schools or approaches. One school of thinkers says that Hitler was actively involved in the occult and he tried to tap into occult power and so forth. The second school of thought, actually some of the more famous historians of Hitler say, no, he wasn't. What I've done is, in my research, is say, well, wait a minute. Let's take a look at this and see if somewhere in between falls the truth. And what I discovered was that, no, Hitler was not actively engaged in occult practices. However, many of his accomplices, Himmler, Hess, and others, were actively engaged in occult practices, and those have been demonstrated. Secondly, Hitler was very much a superstitious man and prone to this magical kind of thinking where he thinks he can will things to happen and they should happen. But he also relied on astrologers.
Oh.
And the Nazis had several astrologers that would cast horoscopes and things for them. Now, Hitler was always tentatively skeptical of those, and I suspect that he was skeptical because he didn't like anyone who had some kind of authority higher than he was. So he always saw these astrologers, yet at the same time he listened to some of those horoscopes as well.
He was concerned that they would tamper with his intuition.
Yes, exactly. Now, in the other area, there has been various research, some of it documented, some of it not, that Hitler had various sexual kinds of problems. None of that has been absolutely what I would call convincingly demonstrated. However, we should know that Hitler really had difficulties in his relationships with women.
Yeah.
He had very stormy relationships. He was involved, for example, with his niece, Gayle Raubel, and
Yes.
she committed suicide because he was much too controlling and so forth. And then later on,
Was there a controversy about whether or not she really committed suicide?
there is some controversy around that. Again, it has never been completely proven or disproven, but there's one thing that's definite, if she did commit suicide, it was because he, in a sense, drove her to it from his, his excessive attention and his obsessiveness. The other thing that I think is important to note is that he did have Eva Braun.
Yes.
And he just put her in Obersalzberg and, in the Alps. He would visit from time to time. He never married her, felt that he couldn't marry as Der Fuhrer because it would make him seem too human. And so he never married Eva Braun until they were in the bunker.
Yeah.
The Russians were descending. He married her. This was around the time of his birthday, April 20th. He married her, and shortly thereafter, they committed suicide, and their bodies they attempted to burn their bodies and so forth. And so he had a very, very odd kind of relationship with women, although a lot of German women were very much attracted to him, almost like a rock star.
Really?
Yeah.
The way he was portrayed as an Uberman,
Yeah.
the idea that Leni Riefenstahl did the movie called The Triumph of the Will.
Triumph of the Will, 1934. Yeah.
And she put the camera down low, and she put it up towards Hitler to make him seem like a massive force.
Yes.
And he just pounded away at the ideas that he was sharing with others.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And even the use of light at those rallies, the Nuremberg rallies, the use of light was powerful because much of the stadium would be in darkness, but where Hitler was all light. And that's a very powerful religious concept, light and darkness. I mean, that's what we have. We celebrate that at Easter, don't we, when the Easter candle comes in?
Yes.
Christ is our light, and it comes into a darkened church. So the idea of light versus darkness is a very powerful supernatural or spiritual image. They usurp that again from the Catholic Church, and they use it in this context so that Hitler is the divine savior.
We only have about a minute left. I wanted to close with the idea that my friend Joseph mentioned when he interviewed Dr. Leo Alexander.
Yes.
Leo Alexander was an official observer from the United States to the United States Army War Crimes Tribunal, otherwise known as the Nuremberg trials. And Joseph asked him about his experience with the Third Reich. And Joseph said to him, "How does this happen? How did the Third Reich kill 12 million people?" And Leo Alexander said to Joseph, "It happened when people accepted the idea that there were other people whose lives were not worthy of continuance."
Absolutely.
We're facing something like this now in the United States Senate, where the Senate and the House decided to allow infanticide following abortion procedures. And we don't have the courage of people to say that even born children have a right to life. Ray, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ray. It was a real pleasure being here. I hope I helped.
You did. And we barely scratched the surface of your article.